Matthew 11:28 through to chapter 12 and verse 10. And we begin with Jesus speaking, and he says some words that over many hundreds of years now, people have held on to these words, and you can understand why as we read them. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. At that time, Jesus went through a grain fields on the Sabbath. And his disciples were hungry and began to pick some of the heads of grain and eat them. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." And he answered, "Haven't you read what David did? When he and his companions were hungry, he entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple desecrate the day and yet are innocent? I tell you that one greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." I think we'll stop there, actually. We won't go on to verse 10. Let's stop there. One thing that I seem to be hearing again and again and again, particularly at this time of year, is that people are tired and they're weary, they're exhausted from all the preparations that apparently we have to make for Christmas. There's lots of extra things to do, lots of running around to do, and people to visit, perhaps cards to write. And doesn't that take an age? Particularly when you start sending out tens of cards, it seems to sort of take. And then those of you that make your own cards, you have to start on January the 1st, I guess, to make those ready for next year. So there's all those sorts of things. There's all the shopping, and of course it's very busy, isn't it? So the places get crowded around about Christmas time with all the busyness of Christmas. And lots of people kind of get to Christmas Day and don't actually enjoy it. Or, well, they probably do, but not as much as perhaps they might like to, because of the exhaustion that they feel in the run-up to Christmas. So what does Jesus have to say about being tired and exhausted? Well, he does say something here, but I'm not sure that he says exactly about physical exhaustion, to be perfectly honest. But I use it as an example because we all understand, particularly this time of year, with all the busyness that goes on, just what it means to be tired physically. But let's try and translate that into a spiritual tiredness. Jesus offers to give rest to the weary, but he then clarifies that and he describes it as rest for your souls. Now, the word soul is one of those words that can have all sorts of meanings. And I don't just mean, that thing that's on the bottom of your shoe, or a fish that swims in the sea, or indeed our spirits. I don't mean that. I mean, literally, when we talk about the human soul, we can mean several things with that. And some people see the soul as just being our conscience or our consciousness, the bit that's inside of us, that kind of switches the lights on in us. Some people see it as being synonymous with the Spirit. And so we see this as being part of what God brings to life in us when he enters us and breathes new life into our spirit, that's breathing life into our souls. And I tend to go more with the latter usually, though I think actually here that Jesus is kind of bridging a little bit across here, because I think he's talking about, up to a point at least, I think his meaning of the word soul, he's talking about that inner me. You know all about that inner you. And I don't think it's just psychological. I think there is something much deeper than that. Because he has breathed new life into you. And he's married together a wonderful gift of new life into a dead you and brought that to life. And it's very difficult for us to be able to separate out what our consciousness is from the spirit that will eventually depart the body. But I think there's something of both here in this. And I think that sometimes we get very weary in ourselves. Sometimes it becomes an extreme weariness that can lead to depression. Sometimes it can just be that we just don't have the will to continue with whatever it is that we're doing. Sometimes that weariness inside of us can just take the form of just not being able to concentrate and to think and to plan. Those kinds of things. And sometimes I think that weariness can lead us to a spiritual desert. I think a place where somehow or other God seems so distant. Everything seems so barren around us. And somehow or other our spiritual lives have no joy left in them. Isaiah speaks in chapter 12 of his work about, and he describes it as that we will draw joy from the wells of salvation. He clearly saw that when we come to the Lord and when we have new life brought from him, that it should actually bring within us joy. And yet I find so many of us as Christians can go around with such long faces on times. The joy has gone. And that's very sad. Why is it that we can't get excited about it? Christmas time's a great time to get excited. When new babies are born, there's always a lot of excitement around them. But when the Saviour of the world is born, there's got to be even more excitement. And that's great. And so I believe with all my heart that Christmas time is a time when we should get excited. There's nothing wrong with celebrating Christmas with a lot of enthusiasm. Let's do that. Why not? But then you see, we come to mornings like today where we have bread and wine in front of us and we celebrate the communion and we remember that Jesus eventually went to the cross and died the most horrific death. And you think, how can we celebrate that with joy and enthusiasm? And that's because I think that the joy that we have as Christians is not a superficial thing, but it's something much deeper inside of us. It's a deeper appreciation for what the Lord has done for you as an individual, for the love that he showed to this world. So Jesus says, come to me. It's the invitation. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened. And that invitation still stands to this day. That anyone who's feeling the strain and the pressure that's being put upon them, and sometimes actually that can manifest itself physically. You see, we are all connected. You can't actually separate out the body from the soul. It is connected. It's meant to be connected. And so when we feel pressure on us physically, it can affect the way we are spiritually. So make no mistake about that. And Jesus demonstrates that as Matthew continues. Now we have to remember that chapters and verses, the divisions that we put into the Bible, they're artificial. Matthew never sat down and wrote chapter 12 and began writing. He wrote it as one continuous piece. And later on, someone in their wisdom sat down and said, okay, let's break this down into easier, more manageable segments so that we can find things easily. And that's a really helpful way of finding our way around the Bible. But having said that, sometimes those divisions can get in the way. And so many of us would get to the end of chapter 11 and stop. But then if you start to read chapter 12, we read at that time, which connects chapter 12 with what's just been said in last verse and of the last verses of chapter 11. And so that's why we've deliberately read on this morning. So Jesus offers the invitation. Come to me, you who are weary and burdened. Take my yoke upon you. Learn from me. I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. At that time, Jesus went through a grain field. What's the connection? Why does Matthew think it's necessary to say that just as Jesus said those words, then they went through a grain field? Because I think that Jesus was then teaching them a lesson, and Matthew has brought that lesson down to us because he says, and here's a practical example of exactly what Jesus meant. Jesus and his disciples went through a grain field, and it happened to be the Sabbath, the holy day of the week, the day when they were to do no work, a day of rest. And Jesus, of course, has just been talking about rest. That's what he's talking about. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. The day of Sabbath, or the Sabbath day was there as a day of rest. But the problem is that the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, had taken this to an extreme, and instead of making it a day of rest, had turned it into a burden. And so Jesus and his disciples, they're walking through a field, and the disciples saw some corn there, and they take the ears of corn and get the kernels out of the husks, put them in their mouths and eat them. And the Pharisees who were watching, I can't imagine why they were watching them walking through a grain field, but they were watching. I kind of get in my mind, the adverts for Aunt Bessie's, where you've got the two old ladies who are always spying on the neighbours in their Yorkshire puddings or whatever it is they're eating in the middle of the week. Well, I've got a feeling that the Pharisees were a bit like that. They got their binoculars out and they were watching every move that Jesus and his disciples made. And they said, we've caught them. They've done something wrong. They've done some work on this. Excuse me, they took a few ears of wheat, rubbed them in their hands and put the kernels in their mouths. Can you really say that's work? And Jesus takes those Pharisees to task and he says to them, this isn't work. This is restoring the physical needs of these people. They were hungry. And what's more, even in the books of the law in the Old Testament, there was nothing to say that a person couldn't eat on the Sabbath. They could do the minimum amount of stuff that they needed to do. That was perfectly all right. God didn't want the Sabbath to be a burden. He wanted it to be a blessing. And so Jesus uses that practical example and he says you need to refresh your bodies in order for you to be fresh in your mind and, of course, in your soul as well. But there's something else that Jesus says in that last verses of chapter 11. Because he speaks in terms, very oddly in a way, in a form of slavery. Take my yoke upon you. Now the yoke was not that orange thing in the middle of an egg, but it was a piece of wood that they used to put over top of the the shoulders of animals, particularly oxen, when they were ploughing fields and things like that. They used to put these there, and they would, it would hold two of the oxen together, and then they would be able to attach to that implements like a plough, a very simple plough, and they would go up and down their fields ploughing, and the yoke would hold these farming implements in place. And the animal would have to work very hard in order to plough the field. Now, Jesus uses that as a symbol. And some people have taken it to mean that that Jesus is saying, that I'm going to put this yoke on your neck. I'm going to chain you up, if you like. And they've then tried to justify that by saying, well, of course, being a slave for Jesus isn't like being a slave as we might know it, but it's because he's a good master. And you could take that, and there are other passages that say something along those lines. But here, the yoke was always put on two animals. Jesus talked about being unequally yoked. Do you remember that phrase in Scripture? Jesus said, do not be unequally yoked. And I often wondered about that phrase until many years ago. There was an old man I used to know, and he'd spent much time out in Israel back in the 1930s and 40s. And he'd got some really old film that he had taken from back in those days when actually life out there was pretty much the same as it was in biblical times. It hadn't moved on very much at all. And he showed us a little bit of his cine film. It's really quite fascinating. There was a very poor farmer trying to plough his field. And he had one ox and he had a donkey. And he put the yoke across from the ox to the donkey. And as a result, the ox being much stronger than the donkey, when they tried to plough the field, they ended up just going round and round in circles. Just goes round and round and round and round. And he said, now you understand why Jesus said, do not be unequally yoked. A poor farmer would have terrible problems trying to plough his field with an ox and a donkey. Yet they had to try. They needed two animals to do it. Now, Jesus is not saying you're going to be like animals, like an ox, and I'm going to be the master. Here, Jesus is placing himself alongside you. Notice what he says here. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. The way in which they trained animals, a young animal, to take on this yoke and to plough the field, way it should do, was to couple it with an experienced animal that knew what to do. And they would put the experienced animal and the new inexperienced animal together, and they would plough together. And the young animal would learn from the older one how to plough. And Jesus is saying, the yoke is around my neck. And I know where I'm going. I know the way. And I can teach you too. And so he's putting himself alongside. He's saying, be like a young ox. Have that yoke upon you and upon me, and we'll do it together. Isn't that comforting? What's more, being experienced as he was, he knew that an experienced ox would know exactly the rigours that were on them. A young animal would get tired very quickly. And it's true, isn't it, that sometimes when we put two people together, the job becomes so much easier than when we just got one person on their own. And Jesus is saying, for you on your own, this is too much. Come with me, I'm experienced, and I'm going to help you out through these situations. So we learn from Jesus. We're linked to him. We can't get away. We put that yoke on us and we are put together. We follow his direction. And then we get the job done. And he says, you'll find that things will be so easy when with me. On your own, it's very difficult. Coupled to me, things get much easier. And in that example that he gives there in the cornfield, Jesus is just showing the nonsense that we can put upon ourselves as human beings. We become very religious people, very pious. We think we're doing it, but in fact we create burdens. And Jesus said, that was never my Father's intention. He doesn't want to make life difficult for you. He wants to make life straight for you. He wants to make it as easy as possible for you. Though, of course, life is never easy. And just like those oxen dragging the plough behind them, we find that there are things in life that kind of dig in and make life a little bit difficult for us too. But he says, don't worry, I'm there for you. Come to me and I'll help you through it. And you know, there's a very simple lesson that we need to learn as Christian people, and that is to make sure that we do come to him. So easy just to do our own thing, so easy to try and find our own way, so easy to get out of fellowship with him, so easy to go from one weekend to the next with never opening our Bible, with never praying a prayer, never giving him a second thought. So easy to let other things push in. The burdens of life that weigh down upon us. I'm too busy to pray. I'm too busy to read the Bible. I'm too busy to get to a Bible study. I'm too busy to come to church. And yet these are the things that will make your burden light. These are the things that will help you through. These are the things that will restore your soul. David, the psalmist, wrote, of course, very famously in the 23rd Psalm about coming to the pools, the ponds, the still waters to be refreshed. And that's another picture for us, that what he does for us is he brings us water to drink and he refreshes us in that way. Now, we have to come. There's an invitation. It's very clear. Come to me, said Jesus. He won't chase after you. He'll offer the invitation, and it's up to you. But the one thing that I know is this, that when we discipline ourselves to say, yes, I will come to him, I will come under his rule, under his authority, I will try and discern his purpose for my life, that when we do that, it brings a newness, a renewal of our souls, a freshness to us. Somehow or other, even though we go through difficult times, somehow we feel as though someone's carrying us through, or to put it in the terms that we're looking at today, that his yoke is easy. His burden is light. He carries us through that. And I just want to encourage you at this time, in this busyness, not to neglect your spiritual well-being, but to give to it even more. The whole purpose of Advent, in actual fact, is that we prepare ourselves for Christmas. The whole purpose is that we spend more time building up to it. And the church invented Advent. I mean, it's not a biblical thing at all. It's a human invention completely. And the same as we approach Easter with Lent, it's another human invention that we've made in order to prepare ourselves, though. But it's a good idea to say, I'm not just going to turn up on Christmas Day and expect to get the most out of it. But in the days leading up to it, I want to prepare myself little by little so that I'm ready to receive the greatest blessing that he intended. Let's just pray.